Y'all, I have been married for almost 14 years now. Coming up on July 24th, because, 24/7. Get it? It's kind of... Anyway, so if you were to ask me if I would consider myself an expert on marriage, I'd have to say that I'm actually know quite a bit...
He's got a ways to go.
This is the Bible vlog. Okay, so today's topic, Paul is actually covering marriage, but let me pause and remind you of one very important fact. Paul is single. The dude never got married. So let me ask you something. If you'd been married for, let's say, 30 years, and along comes your buddy, let's call him Single Bob. And Bob, well, he's got some great marriage advice for you. How likely are you to take what he says to heart? Okay, so that is the exact position that Paul finds himself in when writing to these people. Not only does he have to instruct them in the ways of a biblical marriage, but he has to show the wisdom of the Holy Spirit in overcoming their doubts about him as a valid source on the topic. All right, look at verses 1 through 5. Now, concerning the things of which you wrote to me, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. Nevertheless, because of sexual immorality, let each man have his own wife, and let each woman have her own husband. Let the husband render to his wife the affection due her, and likewise also the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. And likewise the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Do not deprive one another except with consent for a time, that you may give yourselves to fasting and prayer, and come together again, so that Satan does not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. Now there's enough information given here that should absolutely shred some wrong theology out there. And not only does what Paul state here fly in the face of the way that many in the church have treated the topic of sex, but Paul lays out some revolutionary thoughts at the same time. Both the husband and wife have a role to play. Now keep in mind when this was written, keep in mind how many women in some parts of the world are still treated today. It is not with equality. Yet here Paul is 2,000 years ago saying it's not just the woman who has an obligation here. The men need to grow up too and quit acting like boys. Yeah, buddy, your body belongs to your wife just as much as hers belongs to you. So keep in mind that you might crave some intimacy, but she might crave the dishes being done. Lord help me, I'm preaching to myself here too, guys. All right, let's look at the next passage in verses 10 through 15. Now to the married I command, yet not I, but the Lord, a wife is not to depart from her husband. But even if she does depart, let her remain unmarried or be reconciled to her husband, and a husband is not to divorce his wife. But to the rest I, not the Lord, say, if any brother has a wife who does not believe, and she is willing to live with him, let him not divorce her. And a woman who has a husband who does not believe, if he is willing to live with her, let her not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, and the unbelieving wife sanctified by the husband. Otherwise your children would be unclean, but now they are holy. But if the unbeliever departs, let him depart. A brother or a sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God has called us to peace. Okay, now some really insightful instruction on the topic of divorce. I've had people ask me before, they became a Christian and maybe their spouse refused to come to Christ. What should they do? Should they divorce their spouse over their faith? Do they stay? What about being unequally yoked together with an unbeliever? Well, right here is the second reason given in the Bible for divorce. Now, the first is adultery, which Jesus taught in the Gospels, but the second reason is for abandonment, as Paul just described in verse 15. In other words, if your spouse up and leaves or just cuts off the marriage, then you are underneath no obligation to stay or to not get remarried. Now, yes, the Bible does say that God hates divorce, but here Paul shows that there are times where it is allowed. Now, like I've said before, and I feel compelled to say it again, if you are in a situation where there is abuse happening to you or someone else, then you need to let someone know and get yourself or that person out of that situation. You are not under obligation to stay in a situation that puts you, your children, or others you care about in harm's way. If abuse is happening, let someone know. Personally, in almost all of the cases I have seen, abuse ultimately leads to abandonment. All right, one last passage to look at here. Go over to verses 39 through 40. A wife is bound by law as long as her husband lives, but if her husband dies, she is at liberty to be married to whom she wishes only in the Lord. But she is happier if she remains as she is according to my judgment, and I think I also have the Spirit of God. So what about getting remarried if your spouse passes away? Well, again, Paul, writing ahead of his time, shows that we are free to get remarried again after a spouse passes away, but that it should always be with someone who shares our faith. But it's interesting to note that he also points out that there is nothing wrong in remaining single. In fact, as Paul has pointed out throughout the chapter, for himself being single, it's allowed him to focus more of his attention on his relationship with God. Ultimately, choice is up to the individual to be led in the way that they feel that God is showing them to go. Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, that is it for us today with chapter 7 of 1 Corinthians. Whew. Hope you enjoyed that one as much as I did and as much as Sherry did. All right, well, hope you all have a beautiful day. I have some dishes to do now. I will see you back here tomorrow. Love your faces. Bye-bye.